In the 1950s, American mothers were dump and bake masters. With just 50 cents worth of flour, sugar, and butter, they created magic. They turned the simplest pantry staples into desserts that fed entire church congregations. These weren't just recipes. They were small miracles made with smart thinking, love, and quiet pride. Today, we're stepping back into those kitchens to rediscover 30 desserts that defined an era. Which one will bring back your sweetest memory? Texas. Sheetcake became the most popular in church congregations during the 1950s. Your grandmother arrived at the church basement kitchen before sunrise with flour and cocoa tucked under her arm. She grabbed the church's massive 18 by 26-inch jelly roll pan because nobody owned one that size at home. She mixed thin batter and poured it across that metal surface, spreading only 1 inch tall. That thinness mattered because 48 people waited upstairs with empty stomachs after 2 hours on hard pews. The chocolate smell drifted up through the floorboards during the final hymn. Kids nudged their mothers and whispered about dessert coming soon. She pulled the cake from the gas oven and poured hot frosting over the hot surface immediately. It pooled and spread into every corner perfectly. She cut 48 squares fast. People lined up with paper plates. Plates emptied within minutes. Nobody left hungry that Sunday morning. Will you try this dump and bake dessert this weekend? Tag someone you're baking with. Pineapple dump cake became famous in church basements during the 1940s. Your grandmother carried 2 cans of crushed pineapple and 1 box of yellow cake mix to church Saturday morning. She borrowed a 9 by 13-inch pan from the kitchen cabinet where they kept supplies. She dumped both cans of pineapple with all the juice into the bottom of that greased pan. She tore open the cake mix box and poured dry mix over the pineapple without stirring anything. She sliced 1 stick of butter thin and laid pieces across the top like roof shingles. She slid the pan into the oven and walked away for 1 hour. The cake mix absorbed pineapple juice and baked into golden crust. The butter melted down and created crispy edges nobody could resist. She cut 40 squares while it cooled on the counter. Families ate it warm with the juice soaking through. This cost 75 cents and fed everyone. Cherry dump cake appeared at every church potluck during the 1940s and 1950s. Your grandmother bought 2 cans of cherry pie, filling at the corner store for 60 cents total. She arrived at church early and grabbed the biggest glass baking dish from the basement kitchen. She dumped both cans of cherry, filling into that dish, spreading it flat with a spoon. She sprinkled 1 box of white cake mix over the cherries without mixing anything together. She dotted the top with butter slices cut thin and placed close together. The pan went straight into the hot oven for 50 minutes. The cake mix turned golden brown while cherries bubbled up through cracks. The smell filled the entire basement and drifted upstairs during opening hymns. Children counted minutes until service ended so they could run downstairs. She scooped portions onto plates because it was too soft to slice. 40 people got servings. The cherries stained everything red, but nobody cared. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Peach cobbler fed church congregations throughout the 1940s summer months. Your grandmother opened 2 large cans of sliced peaches and dumped them into a 9 by 13-inch pan with all the syrup. She mixed 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 1 cup of milk, and 1 egg in a bowl quickly. She poured that thin batter over the peaches without stirring them at all. She dotted the top with butter pieces and sprinkled cinnamon sugar across everything. The pan baked for 45 minutes until the batter rose up through the peaches, forming a golden crust. The syrup bubbled around the edges and caramelized against the hot pan. She let it cool for 10 minutes before scooping portions into bowls. 40 people lined up with spoons ready because cobbler was too soft for forks. The peaches stayed warm and sweet for hours on the buffet table. This cost under $1. Wacky cake saved church families during the 1930s depression when eggs and butter disappeared from stores. Your grandmother mixed this cake right inside the 9 by 13-inch pan without using any bowls at all. She measured flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, and salt, and dumped everything into the greased pan. She made 3 wells in the dry ingredients with her finger. She poured vinegar in one well, vanilla in another well, and oil in the third well. She poured cold water over everything and stirred with a fork until smooth. The pan went straight into the oven for 30 minutes. No eggs, no butter, no milk, no bowls, no mess, no problem. The cake rose perfectly and stayed moist for days. She cut 35 squares, and nobody knew it was a depression recipe. This fed everyone for 50 cents total when money ran out. Children asked for seconds always. 5. Dump-and-bake desserts fed church congregations for pennies. Texas sheet cake cost $1.50. Pineapple dump cake used 2 cans and cake mix. Cherry version stained everything red. Peach cobbler bubbled in summer. Wacky cake needed no eggs or butter. Which forgotten dessert will you dump and bake this weekend? 5 more desserts coming next. Brown Betty appeared at church potlucks every fall during the 1920s harvest season. Your grandmother saved stale bread all week long and let it dry completely on the counter. She tore that bread into rough crumbs with her hands over a big bowl. She melted butter and poured it over the crumbs, tossing everything until coated. She sliced apples thin from the church orchard out back where trees dropped fruit for free. She layered breadcrumbs on the bottom of a 9 by 13-inch pan, then added apple slices. She sprinkled sugar and cinnamon over apples, then added more breadcrumbs on top. She repeated layers until the pan filled completely to the rim. She baked it for 1 hour until apples turned soft and breadcrumbs turned crispy brown. She scooped portions while it was still warm and steaming. 35 people ate servings. This cost almost nothing because stale bread was free. Pineapple upside-down cake became a church potluck favorite during the 1940s when canned pineapple was affordable. Your grandmother melted butter in a 9 by 13-inch pan right on the stovetop first. She sprinkled brown sugar over that melted butter until it covered the bottom completely. She arranged pineapple rings in neat rows across the brown sugar like soldiers standing at attention. She dropped maraschino cherries into the center of each ring for color. She mixed simple yellow cake batter in one bowl and poured it over the fruit carefully. The pan went into the oven for 40 minutes while she cleaned up. The cake baked golden brown and pulled away from the edges. She let it cool for 5 minutes, then flipped the whole pan upside down onto a serving platter. The pineapple stayed on top, glistening with caramelized sugar. She cut 36 squares. People ate it warm with the syrup dripping down. Hello Dolly bars appeared at every church potluck during the 1950s after condensed milk became popular. Your grandmother crushed graham crackers in a bag with a rolling pin until they turned into fine crumbs. She melted butter and mixed it with those crumbs, pressing everything into the bottom of a 9 by 13-inch pan. She sprinkled chocolate chips over the crust in one thick layer, covering every inch. She added butterscotch chips next, then sprinkled shredded coconut over everything. She poured 1 can of sweetened condensed milk back and forth across the pan, drizzling over all the layers. She pressed chopped pecans on top as the final layer. The pan baked for 25 minutes until the edges turned golden and bubbly. She let it cool completely before cutting because it was too gooey when hot. She cut tiny 1.5-inch squares because these bars were incredibly rich. 42 people got pieces. They cost $1 total. Cherry Crisp fed church families during the 1940s when fresh cherries came into season every June. Your grandmother pitted 2 quarts of fresh cherries by hand sitting at the basement table. She dumped those cherries into a 9 by 13-inch pan and sprinkled sugar over them. She mixed oats, flour, brown sugar, and melted butter in a bowl until crumbly. She spread that oat mixture over the cherries in an even layer without pressing it down. The pan baked for 40 minutes until cherries bubbled up through the topping and the oats turned golden. The smell of warm cherries filled the basement and made everyone hungry before the meal even started. She scooped portions into bowls while it was still hot and steaming. 40 people lined up with spoons because crisp was too soft for forks. The cherry juice stained their lips red. This cost under $1 when cherries were in season. Magic cookie bars became famous in church basements during the 1950s when Eagle brand condensed milk advertised this recipe. Your grandmother melted butter in a 9 by 13-inch pan and poured graham cracker crumbs over it, pressing flat. She opened 1 bag of chocolate chips and spread them across the crust in 1 layer. She added 1 bag of butterscotch chips on top of the chocolate, covering every space. She sprinkled sweetened shredded coconut over everything until you couldn't see the chips anymore. She poured 1 can of condensed milk back and forth in stripes, letting it soak down. She pressed chopped walnuts on top as the final layer before baking. The pan went into the oven for 25 minutes until edges bubbled and turned golden brown. She let it cool overnight because cutting it warm made a sticky mess. She cut 42 tiny squares the next morning. People called them magic because 7 layers held together perfectly. 10 dump-and-bake desserts kept church families fed. Apple brown, Betty used free stale bread. Pineapple upside down, flipped onto platters. Hello, Dolly bars layered 7 ingredients. Cherry Crisp stained lips red. Magic cookie bars held together like magic. Which dessert will you bake for your congregation this month? 20 more desserts coming next. Blueberry dump cake appeared at church potlucks during the 1950s when canned blueberries became available in stores year-round. Your grandmother walked to church carrying 2 cans of blueberry pie, filling wrapped in a flour sack towel to keep them from rattling. She arrived early and pulled out the church's favorite 9 by 13-inch glass baking dish from the cabinet where they kept community supplies. She dumped both cans of blueberry filling into that dish and spread it flat with the back of a big metal spoon. The filling looked dark purple and smelled sweet even before baking started. She opened 1 box of yellow cake mix and poured the entire box over the blueberries without stirring anything together. The dry mix sat on top like a blanket of yellow snow, covering the purple fruit completely. She sliced 1 stick of butter thin and laid pieces across the top in neat rows like tiles on a roof. She didn't mix or stir or fuss with anything at all. The pan went straight into the hot gas oven and baked for 50 minutes. The cake mix absorbed the blueberry juice and turned golden brown on top. The blueberries bubbled up through cracks and created a beautiful purple and gold pattern. She let it cool on the counter for 10 minutes before cutting. She scooped 40 portions onto small plates because this dessert was too soft and juicy to slice cleanly. The blueberry juice ran everywhere and stained napkins purple. People licked their forks clean and asked for seconds. This cost 80 cents total and fed everyone perfectly. Apple dump cake became a church basement staple during the 1940s when apple orchards produced more fruit than families could eat fresh. Your grandmother arrived at church on Saturday afternoon carrying 2 large cans of apple pie, filling she bought for 30 cents each. She borrowed the church's biggest metal baking pan and set it on the scarred wooden work table in the basement kitchen. She dumped both cans of apple filling into that pan and used a fork to spread it evenly across the bottom. The apples smelled like cinnamon and sugar, even cold from the can. She tore open one box of yellow cake mix and poured the dry powder over the apples without mixing anything. The cake mix formed a pale yellow layer that covered every apple slice completely. She unwrapped one stick of butter and sliced it thin using the church's dull paring knife. She laid butter slices across the top in rows, making sure to cover as much surface as possible. The pan slid into the gas oven set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 1 hour and went upstairs to help set tables for Sunday dinner. The smell of baking apples and butter filled the entire church building during the last hymn. Children whispered to their mothers, asking when they could eat dessert downstairs. She pulled the cake out when the top turned golden brown and butter pooled around the edges. She cut 40 squares while it was still warm. Families ate it standing up with paper plates balanced in their hands. This cost 70 cents, and nobody complained. Pumpkin dump cake appeared at church Thanksgiving dinners during the 1940s when canned pumpkin became widely available in stores. Your grandmother bought 1 large can of pumpkin puree and 1 can of evaporated milk at the corner grocery store. She arrived at church early on Thanksgiving morning before anyone else came to prepare the turkey and stuffing. She pulled out a 9 by 13-inch pan and greased it with butter rubbed from a stick wrapped in wax paper. She opened the can of pumpkin and dumped it into a mixing bowl with the evaporated milk. She added sugar, eggs, cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg, stirring everything together until smooth and creamy. She poured that pumpkin mixture into the greased pan, spreading it flat across the bottom. The mixture looked thick and orange, like pumpkin pie filling. She opened 1 box of yellow cake mix and sprinkled the entire box over the pumpkin layer without stirring. The dry cake mix covered the wet pumpkin completely like a blanket of yellow powder. She sliced 1 stick of butter thin and arranged pieces across the top in neat rows. She sprinkled chopped pecans over everything as the final layer. The pan went into the oven for 55 minutes while she peeled potatoes for mashed potatoes. The cake baked until the top turned golden brown and crispy. The pumpkin stayed soft and creamy underneath. She cut 40 squares and served them warm after dinner ended. People said it tasted like pumpkin pie without the crust. This cost $1.20 total. Apple snickerdoodle dump cake became popular at church potlucks during the 1940s when cinnamon was affordable again after wartime rationing ended. Your grandmother walked to church carrying 2 cans of apple pie filling and a small jar of ground cinnamon tucked in her apron pocket. She arrived early and pulled the church's glass baking dish from the cabinet where supplies stayed organized. She dumped both cans of apple filling into that dish and spread them flat with a wooden spoon. The apples already had cinnamon mixed in, but she wanted more. She mixed extra cinnamon with white sugar in a small bowl, creating a cinnamon sugar mixture. She sprinkled half of that mixture over the apples, covering them completely. She opened 1 box of yellow cake mix and poured it over the apples without stirring anything together. The dry mix formed a thick layer on top. She sliced 1 stick of butter thin and laid pieces across the cake mix in neat rows. She sprinkled the remaining cinnamon sugar mixture over the butter as the final layer. The pan went into the hot oven and baked for 50 minutes. The cinnamon sugar on top caramelized and formed a crispy crust. The smell filled the basement and made everyone hungry before dinner even started. She cut 40 squares while it cooled on the counter. The top stayed crunchy like snickerdoodle cookies, while the inside stayed soft and apple-filled. People said this tasted better than regular apple cake. This cost 90 cents total and fed everyone with seconds left over. Lemon Lush bars became famous at church potlucks during the 1950s when instant lemon pudding mix appeared in stores. Your grandmother arrived at church carrying a box of lemon pudding, a package of cream cheese, and a container of whipped topping. She borrowed the church's 9 by 13-inch glass pan and greased it with butter. She crushed graham crackers in a plastic bag using a rolling pin until they turned into fine crumbs. She melted butter and mixed it with those crumbs, pressing everything into the bottom of the pan to form a crust. The crust baked for 10 minutes until it turned golden and firm. She let it cool completely while she mixed the filling. She beat cream cheese with powdered sugar until smooth and creamy. She folded in half the container of whipped topping, making it light and fluffy. She spread that mixture over the cooled crust in an even layer. She mixed lemon pudding with cold milk, whisking until thick. She spread the lemon pudding over the cream cheese layer carefully. She topped everything with the remaining whipped topping, spreading it smooth. The pan went into the church refrigerator overnight to set completely. The next morning she cut tiny 1.5-inch squares because these bars were incredibly rich and sweet. 42 people got pieces served on small paper plates. The lemon was tangy and sweet at the same time. The cream cheese made it smooth, and the whipped topping made it light. This cost $1.50 total, and everyone asked for the recipe. 15 dump-and-bake desserts saved church budgets. Blueberry-stained napkins, purple. Apple dump cake smelled like orchards. Pumpkin tasted like pie without crust. Apple snickerdoodle stayed crunchy on top. Lemon Lush needed overnight chilling. Which forgotten dessert surprised you most? 5 more powerful desserts coming next. German chocolate dump cake appeared at church potlucks during the 1950s when German chocolate cake became popular across America. Your grandmother bought 1 box of German chocolate cake mix and 1 can of coconut pecan frosting at the grocery store. She arrived at church early and pulled out a 9 by 13-inch metal baking pan from the cabinet. She dumped 1 can of sweetened condensed milk into the bottom of that greased pan, spreading it thin with a spoon. She opened the can of coconut pecan frosting and spooned it over the condensed milk in dollops across the pan. She didn't spread it smooth because it would mix during baking anyway. She tore open the German chocolate cake mix box and poured the entire box of dry mix over the frosting layer. The dark chocolate powder covered everything like a brown blanket. She sliced 1 stick of butter thin and laid pieces across the top in neat rows, making sure to cover as much surface as possible. She pressed chopped pecans into the butter as the final layer. The pan went into the hot oven for 45 minutes. The cake mix absorbed the condensed milk and frosting underneath, creating a fudgy bottom layer. The top turned crispy and golden brown. She let it cool for 15 minutes before cutting because it was too gooey when hot. She cut 40 squares and served them on paper plates. The bottom stayed gooey like frosting, while the top stayed cakey. People said this tasted like German chocolate cake turned inside out. This cost $1.30 total. Strawberry dump cake became a church favorite during the 1950s when frozen strawberries became available year-round in stores. Your grandmother bought 2 packages of frozen strawberries with sugar already mixed in. She let them thaw overnight in the church refrigerator so they would be ready Sunday morning. She pulled out the church's glass 9 by 13-inch baking dish and greased it with butter rubbed from a cold stick. She dumped both packages of thawed strawberries into that dish with all the sweet red juice. The strawberries smelled fresh and sweet even though they came from the freezer. She opened one box of white cake mix and poured the entire box over the strawberries without stirring anything together. The white powder covered the red fruit completely. She sliced one stick of butter thin and arranged pieces across the top in neat rows like roof tiles. She added sliced almonds over the butter as the final touch. The pan went into the hot oven and baked for 50 minutes. The cake mix absorbed the strawberry juice and turned pink around the edges where the fruit touched it. The top turned golden brown and crispy. The strawberries bubbled up through cracks, creating beautiful red streaks through the yellow cake. She let it cool on the counter for 10 minutes before scooping. She served 40 portions on small plates because this dessert was too soft and juicy to cut cleanly. The strawberry juice ran everywhere and stained napkins pink. People said it tasted like strawberry shortcake without the work. This cost $1 total. Lazy Daisy cake became popular at church potlucks during the 1950s because it required only one bowl and minimal effort. Your grandmother mixed this entire cake in one big yellow mixing bowl at home before church. She beat eggs with sugar until thick and pale yellow. She added flour, baking powder, salt, and vanilla, stirring everything together with a wooden spoon. She heated milk and butter together on the stove until the butter melted completely. She poured that hot milk mixture into the batter and stirred until smooth. She poured the thin batter into a greased 9 by 13-inch pan. The batter spread thin across the bottom, barely covering it. The cake baked for 25 minutes until it pulled away from the edges. While it baked, she made the broiled topping. She mixed melted butter, brown sugar, coconut, and cream together in a small saucepan. She spread that mixture over the hot cake the moment it came out of the oven. She put the cake under the broiler for 3 minutes, watching through the oven door window. The topping bubbled and caramelized, turning golden brown on top. She pulled it out before it burned. The coconut toasted and smelled like candy. She let it cool completely before cutting because the topping was too hot. She cut 36 squares at church before service started. The cake stayed moist underneath, while the top stayed crunchy and sweet. People called it Lazy Daisy because it was so easy to make. This cost 90 cents total, and nobody left hungry. Blackberry cobbler fed church congregations during the 1940s when blackberries grew wild along country roads for free. Your grandmother sent her children out with metal pails to pick blackberries Saturday afternoon. They came back with purple-stained fingers and full buckets. She washed the berries, carefully removing leaves and stems. She dumped 4 cups of fresh blackberries into a 9 by 13-inch pan and sprinkled sugar over them. The sugar helped draw out the juice from the berries. She mixed flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt in a bowl. She added milk and melted butter, stirring until it formed a thin batter. She poured that batter over the blackberries without stirring them at all. The batter settled around the berries and filled the spaces between them. She dotted the top with extra butter pieces and sprinkled sugar across everything. The pan went into the hot oven for 45 minutes. The batter rose up through the blackberries, forming a golden crust on top. The blackberry juice bubbled around the edges and caramelized against the hot pan, creating crispy bits. She let it cool for 10 minutes before scooping portions into bowls. 40 people lined up with spoons because cobbler was too soft for forks. Coconut macaroon bars appeared at church potlucks during the 1920s when shredded coconut became affordable in stores. Your grandmother bought 1 bag of sweetened shredded coconut and 1 can of sweetened condensed milk. She arrived at church early and pulled out a 9 by 13-inch pan from the cabinet. She crushed graham crackers in a bag with a rolling pin until they turned into fine crumbs. She melted butter and mixed it with those crumbs, pressing everything into the bottom of the greased pan firmly. The crust formed a solid base that wouldn't fall apart. She baked the crust alone for 10 minutes until it turned golden and firm. She let it cool while she mixed the topping. She opened the bag of coconut and dumped it into a bowl. She poured 1 can of sweetened condensed milk over the coconut and stirred until every shred was coated completely. She added vanilla extract and a pinch of salt to enhance the coconut flavor. She spread that coconut mixture over the cooled crust, pressing it down firmly with the back of a spoon. The layer was thick and white like fresh snow. The pan went back into the oven for 25 minutes. The coconut turned golden brown on top, and the condensed milk caramelized underneath. She let it cool completely overnight before cutting because it was too soft when warm. She cut tiny 1.5-inch squares the next morning because these bars were very rich and sweet. 42 people got pieces. This cost $1 and tasted like macaroons without rolling each cookie. 20 dump-and-bake desserts kept congregations fed for pennies. German chocolate turned inside out. Strawberry-stained napkins pink. Lazy Daisy needed 1 bowl only. Blackberry came from wild roadside picking. Coconut macaroon tasted like cookies. Which dessert will you make for church this month? 10 more powerful desserts remain. Buttermilk sheetcake became a church basement favorite during the 1950s when buttermilk was cheap and every farm family had extra to spare. Your grandmother arrived at church early Sunday morning carrying a quart jar of fresh buttermilk wrapped in a flour sack towel to keep it cold. She walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the basement kitchen where the big gas oven waited. She pulled out the church's largest metal baking pan, measuring 18 inches by 26 inches. This was the same pan they used for Texas sheetcake, but today she was making something different. She greased that enormous pan with butter rubbed from a cold stick across every corner and edge. She measured flour and sugar into the church's biggest mixing bowl, sitting on the scarred wooden work table. She added baking soda and salt, stirring the dry ingredients together with a wooden spoon. She heated butter and water together in a saucepan on the stovetop until the butter melted completely and the mixture started to boil. She poured that hot butter mixture over the dry ingredients and stirred quickly. The batter turned smooth and thin like pancake batter. She cracked 2 eggs into the bowl and added the buttermilk she brought from home. She stirred everything together until no lumps remained in the batter. The batter poured into that greased pan like silk, spreading thin across the entire surface. It barely covered the bottom, measuring only 1/2 inch deep when she finished pouring. She slid the pan into the hot gas oven set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 20 minutes and went upstairs to help set tables for Sunday dinner after service. The smell of baking cake drifted up through the floorboards during the final hymn. Children nudged their mothers and whispered about dessert waiting downstairs in the basement kitchen. She pulled the cake out when the edges turned golden brown and pulled away from the sides. She made frosting while the cake was still hot in the pan. She heated butter, buttermilk, and cocoa together on the stovetop, stirring constantly. She added powdered sugar and vanilla, stirring until smooth and thick. She poured that hot frosting over the hot cake immediately. The frosting melted into every crack and crevice, creating a fudgy layer on top. She let it cool for 15 minutes before cutting. She cut 48 small squares, measuring 3 inches each. People lined up with paper plates balanced in their hands. Spice sheet cake appeared at church potlucks during the 1940s when sugar was rationed, but spices were still available in stores. Your grandmother walked to church carrying a small tin of cinnamon, a jar of ground cloves, and a container of nutmeg tucked in her apron pockets. She arrived early and descended the basement stairs into the church kitchen where the industrial oven sat against the far wall. She pulled out a 9 by 13 inch metal baking pan from the cabinet, where supplies stayed organized on wooden shelves. She greased that pan with lard scooped from a tin kept in the church refrigerator. She measured flour, brown sugar, and baking soda into a big yellow mixing bowl on the work table. She added the spices she brought from home, measuring carefully because spices were expensive even during the war. She added cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger, stirring the dry ingredients until the mixture turned light brown from all the spices. She heated butter and strong black coffee together on the stovetop until the butter melted and the mixture started to simmer. The coffee made the spices taste stronger and deeper. She poured that hot coffee mixture over the dry ingredients and stirred with a wooden spoon. The batter turned dark brown and smelled like Christmas morning. She cracked one egg into the bowl and added buttermilk, stirring everything together until smooth. The batter poured into the greased pan, spreading thin across the bottom. She tapped the pan on the counter to remove air bubbles trapped underneath. The pan went into the hot oven for 35 minutes. She made a simple powdered sugar glaze while the cake baked. She mixed powdered sugar with vanilla and milk, stirring until it reached the right consistency for drizzling. She pulled the cake from the oven when a toothpick inserted in the center came out clean. She let it cool for 10 minutes on the counter before pouring the glaze over the top. The glaze ran into every crack and pooled around the edges. The spices filled the entire basement with a warm smell that made everyone hungry before dinner even started. Children ran downstairs, following their noses, asking when they could eat dessert. She cut 36 squares when the glaze hardened slightly. Families ate standing up with paper plates because all the tables were already full of dinner food. The cake tasted like gingerbread, but softer and sweeter. Lemon sheet cake became popular at church potlucks during the 1950s when fresh lemons were available year-round in stores. Your grandmother bought 4 large lemons at the corner grocery store for 20 cents. She arrived at church Saturday afternoon carrying those lemons wrapped in a paper bag. She walked down into the basement kitchen and pulled out the church's favorite 9 by 13-inch glass baking dish. She greased that dish with butter rubbed across the bottom and up the sides. She zested all 4 lemons using the smallest holes on the metal grater. The lemon zest fell like yellow snow into a small bowl. She cut the lemons in half and squeezed the juice into a measuring cup. She got almost half a cup of fresh lemon juice. She measured flour, sugar, baking powder, and salt into the church's big mixing bowl. She added the lemon zest and stirred it through the dry ingredients. The zest made everything smell bright and fresh. She melted butter in a saucepan on the stovetop and let it cool slightly. She cracked 3 eggs into another bowl and beat them with a fork. She added the melted butter, milk, and lemon juice to the eggs, stirring everything together. She poured that wet mixture into the dry ingredients and stirred with a wooden spoon until smooth. The batter turned pale yellow from all the lemon juice and zest. She poured the batter into the greased dish, spreading it evenly. The pan went into the hot oven, set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 30 minutes and went upstairs to help arrange flowers on the tables. The smell of baking lemon cake filled the basement and drifted up through the floorboards. People commented on how good it smelled even before they saw the cake. She pulled the cake from the oven when it turned golden brown on top. She made lemon glaze while the cake cooled on the counter. She mixed powdered sugar with fresh lemon juice and a little melted butter, stirring until smooth and pourable. She poured that glaze over the warm cake, letting it soak into the top. The glaze hardened slightly as it cooled, creating a thin, sugary crust. She cut 36 squares before church service started Sunday morning. Families ate this cake after dinner ended. Cherry pineapple. Dump cake became famous at church potlucks during the 1950s when canned fruit combinations became popular across America. Your grandmother walked to church carrying 1 can of cherry pie filling and 1 can of crushed pineapple she bought at the corner store. She arrived early and descended the basement stairs into the kitchen, where morning light came through small windows near the ceiling. She pulled out a 9 by 13-inch glass baking dish from the cabinet and set it on the wooden work table. She greased that dish with butter rubbed from a stick wrapped in wax paper. She opened the can of cherry pie filling and dumped it into one side of the dish. The cherries fell out in a thick red mass. She opened the can of crushed pineapple and dumped it into the other side of the dish without draining the juice. The pineapple was yellow and wet with sweet juice. She used a spoon to spread both fruits flat, but kept them separated on different sides of the pan. The cherries stayed on the left, and the pineapple stayed on the right. She tore open 1 box of yellow cake mix and poured the entire box over both fruits. The dry mix covered everything like a yellow blanket. She didn't stir or mix anything together at all. She unwrapped 1 stick of butter and sliced it thin with the church's paring knife. She laid butter slices across the top in neat rows, making sure to cover as much cake mix as possible. Some butter pieces went over the cherry side and some went over the pineapple side. The pan slid into the hot gas oven, set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 50 minutes and went upstairs to help prepare vegetables for Sunday dinner. The smell of baking fruit and butter filled the basement as the cake cooked. The cake mix absorbed the cherry juice and pineapple juice, turning golden brown on top. The fruits bubbled up through cracks, creating beautiful red and yellow swirls. She pulled the cake from the oven when the top turned crispy and golden. She let it cool on the counter for 15 minutes before cutting. She scooped 40 portions onto paper plates because this dessert was too soft and juicy to slice cleanly. Some people got mostly cherry, and some got mostly pineapple, depending on which side she scooped from. Peachberry dump cake appeared at church potlucks during the 1940s when mixed fruit became popular for stretching expensive ingredients. Your grandmother walked to church carrying 1 can of sliced peaches and 1 package of frozen mixed berries she thawed overnight. She arrived Saturday afternoon and walked down into the basement kitchen where the big oven sat ready. She pulled out the church's 9 by 13-inch metal baking pan and set it on the scarred wooden work table. She greased that pan with lard, scooped from a tin kept in the refrigerator. She opened the can of peaches and dumped them into the pan with all the sweet syrup. The peach slices fell out in a pile and she spread them flat with a spoon. She dumped the thawed berries over the peaches. The package contained strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries all mixed together. The berry juice was dark purple and stained her hands. She spread the berries evenly over the peaches, creating a colorful layer of fruit. She sprinkled white sugar over the fruit to add extra sweetness. She tore open 1 box of yellow cake mix and poured the entire box over the fruit without stirring. The dry mix covered everything like a pale yellow blanket. She unwrapped 1 stick of butter and sliced it thin laying pieces across the top in neat rows. She added sliced almonds over the butter as the final layer. The almonds would toast and add crunch to the finished cake. The pan went into the hot oven and baked for 55 minutes. The cake mix absorbed the peach syrup and berry juice, turning golden brown on top. The fruits bubbled up through cracks, creating beautiful streaks of orange, red, and purple. The almonds toasted and turned golden brown, releasing a nutty smell. She pulled the cake from the oven when the edges turned crispy and pulled away from the sides. She let it cool on the counter for 10 minutes before serving. She scooped 40 portions onto small plates because this dessert was very soft and juicy. The peaches and berries ran together, creating a sweet, fruity mixture. Children loved the bright colors and sweet taste. Mothers appreciated that it contained real fruit, even though it was dessert. The almonds on top provided crunch against the soft fruit underneath. People said this tasted like summer, even though it was made with canned and frozen fruit. 25 dump-and-bake desserts fed church congregations for pennies. Buttermilk. Sheet cake stayed moist for days. Spice cake smelled like Christmas. Lemon tasted like sunshine. Cherry pineapple swirled red and yellow. Peachberry mixed summer fruits. Which forgotten dessert will you dump and bake first? 5 more powerful desserts coming next. Apple pandowdy became a church basement staple during the 1920s when apples were the only fruit available all winter long. Your grandmother walked to church carrying a basket of apples from the root cellar where they stored through cold months. She arrived early and descended into the basement kitchen where the wood-burning stove sat in the corner. She pulled out a 9 by 13-inch metal baking pan and greased it with lard. She peeled and sliced 8 large apples, letting the peels fall into a bowl for the chickens. She arranged apple slices in the pan, overlapping them like fallen dominoes. She sprinkled brown sugar over the apples until they were covered completely. She added cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pinch of salt across the top. She dotted the apples with small pieces of butter cut from a cold stick. She mixed flour, more brown sugar, baking powder, and salt in a bowl. She cut cold butter into that flour mixture using 2 knives until it looked like coarse crumbs. She added milk, slowly stirring until a thick batter formed. She dropped spoonfuls of that batter over the apples. The batter didn't cover the apples completely, but that was correct for pandowdy. She pressed the batter down slightly with the back of the spoon. The pan went into the hot wood-burning oven. She had to watch the temperature carefully because wood ovens were unpredictable. She added wood when the fire got too low and opened the damper when it got too hot. The pandowdy baked for 45 minutes until the biscuit topping turned golden brown. She pulled it from the oven and did something strange. She took a knife and cut through the topping, pushing the biscuit pieces down into the apple juice underneath. This was called dowdying, and it made the topping soak up all the apple flavor. She put the pan back in the oven for 10 more minutes. The topping absorbed the juice and turned golden and crispy on the edges. The apples became soft and sweet underneath. She let it cool on the counter for 15 minutes before serving. She scooped portions into bowls because pandowdy was too messy to cut into squares. 36 people got servings spooned onto plates. The topping was half crispy and half soft from soaking in juice. The apples were sweet and spiced perfectly. Children ate every bite and licked their forks clean. Mothers said this was better than apple pie because it was easier to make and served more people. The church kept the recipe written on a card in the kitchen drawer. This cost 60 cents total because apples from the root cellar were practically free after harvest season ended. Mississippi mudcake became famous at church potlucks during the 1950s when chocolate became affordable again after wartime rationing ended. Your grandmother walked to church carrying cocoa powder and a bag of marshmallows she bought at the corner store. She arrived early and pulled out the church's 9 by 13-inch glass baking dish from the cabinet. She greased that dish with butter rubbed across every corner. She measured flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and salt into the church's big mixing bowl. She stirred the dry ingredients together until the cocoa was evenly distributed. She heated butter and water together in a saucepan on the stovetop until the butter melted and the mixture started to boil. She poured that hot mixture over the dry ingredients and stirred with a wooden spoon. The batter turned dark brown, like Mississippi River mud. She cracked 2 eggs into the bowl and added buttermilk and vanilla. She stirred everything together until smooth and thin. The batter poured into the greased dish, spreading easily across the bottom. She added 1 cup of chopped pecans to the batter, stirring them in. The pan went into the hot gas oven set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 30 minutes. The cake baked until it pulled away from the edges slightly. She opened a bag of miniature marshmallows while the cake baked. When the timer went off, she pulled the cake from the oven. She immediately sprinkled marshmallows over the hot cake, covering every inch. The marshmallows started melting from the heat. She put the pan back in the oven for 3 more minutes. The marshmallows puffed up and turned golden brown on top. She pulled the cake out and let it cool while she made chocolate frosting. She melted butter and cocoa together on the stovetop. She added powdered sugar and milk, stirring until smooth and thick. She poured that frosting over the marshmallow layer while everything was still warm. The frosting melted the marshmallows slightly, creating swirls of chocolate and white. She let the whole thing cool completely before cutting. She cut 36 squares when the frosting hardened. The cake was incredibly rich and chocolate. The marshmallows added sweetness and chewiness. The pecans added crunch throughout. The frosting on top made it even more decadent. People called it Mississippi mud because it looked like the muddy riverbanks covered in gooey chocolate. Children loved the marshmallows. Adults loved the intense chocolate flavor. Sock It to Me cake appeared at church potlucks during the 1950s when the name became popular from a television comedy show. Your grandmother walked to church carrying a box of yellow cake mix and a container of sour cream. She arrived early Saturday morning and descended into the basement kitchen. She pulled out a 9 by 13-inch metal baking pan and greased it with butter. She opened the cake mix box and poured it into the church's big mixing bowl. She added eggs, oil, and sour cream according to the package directions. She beat everything together with a wooden spoon until smooth. The sour cream made the batter thick and creamy. She poured half the batter into the greased pan, spreading it evenly. She mixed brown sugar, cinnamon, and chopped pecans together in a small bowl. She sprinkled that mixture over the batter in the pan, creating a cinnamon sugar layer. She poured the remaining batter over the cinnamon layer, covering it completely. She used a knife to swirl through the batter, creating ribbons of cinnamon throughout. The swirling made beautiful patterns when you cut the cake later. The pan went into the hot oven for 40 minutes. The cake rose and turned golden brown on top. The cinnamon layer stayed in the middle, creating a surprise when people bit into it. She made glaze while the cake cooled slightly. She mixed powdered sugar with vanilla and milk, stirring until it reached the right consistency for drizzling. She poured that glaze over the warm cake, letting it run down the sides and pool around the edges. The glaze soaked into the top, creating a sweet crust. She let everything cool completely before cutting. She cut 36 squares when the glaze hardened. Each square had visible cinnamon swirls running through the middle. The cake was incredibly moist from the sour cream. The cinnamon layer added sweetness and spice. The pecans added crunch. The glaze on top added extra sweetness. People loved biting into the cake and discovering the hidden cinnamon layer. Children asked what made it so good. Your grandmother said it was the surprise in the middle. The name Sock It to Me came from a comedy show where someone always said that phrase. The cake delivered a surprise just like the television show. People laughed when she told them the name. They said the cake really did sock it to them with flavor. Oatmeal cake with broiled frosting became a church favorite during the 1950s when oatmeal was cheap and healthy. Your grandmother walked to church carrying a container of rolled oats from her pantry. She arrived early and walked down into the basement kitchen. She pulled out a 9 by 13-inch metal baking pan and greased it with butter. She measured rolled oats into a bowl and poured boiling water over them. She let the oats soak for 20 minutes until they absorbed all the water and turned soft. She measured flour, baking soda, cinnamon, nutmeg, and salt into the church's big mixing bowl. She added white sugar and brown sugar, stirring the dry ingredients together. She added the softened oats to the dry ingredients. She cracked 2 eggs into the bowl and added melted butter and vanilla. She stirred everything together with a wooden spoon until smooth. The batter was thick and heavy from all the oats. She poured the batter into the greased pan, spreading it evenly with the back of the spoon. The pan went into the hot oven for 35 minutes. The cake baked until it pulled away from the edges and turned golden brown. She made the broiled frosting while the cake cooled slightly. She melted butter in a saucepan and added brown sugar, cream, and shredded coconut. She stirred everything together until the sugar dissolved completely. She spread that mixture over the warm cake, covering every inch. The frosting looked wet and sticky. She put the pan under the broiler in the oven for 3 minutes, watching carefully through the door window. The frosting bubbled and caramelized, turning golden brown on top. The coconut toasted and released a sweet smell. She pulled it out before it burned. The frosting hardened slightly as it cooled, creating a crunchy layer on top. She let everything cool completely before cutting. She cut 36 squares when the frosting was firm enough. The oatmeal made the cake dense and hearty. The spices made it taste warm and cozy. The broiled frosting was incredibly sweet and crunchy. The coconut added texture and flavor. People said this cake tasted like breakfast and dessert combined. Peanut butter sheet cake became popular at church potlucks during the 1970s when peanut butter was in every pantry. Your grandmother walked to church carrying a large jar of creamy peanut butter. She arrived early Sunday morning and descended into the basement kitchen. She pulled out the church's 9 by 13-inch glass baking dish and greased it with butter. She measured flour, sugar, baking soda, and salt into the church's big yellow mixing bowl. She heated water and butter together in a saucepan on the stovetop until the butter melted and the mixture started to boil. She added peanut butter to that hot mixture, stirring until it melted completely. She poured the hot peanut butter mixture over the dry ingredients and stirred with a wooden spoon. The batter turned tan-colored and smelled like peanut butter. She cracked 2 eggs into the bowl and added buttermilk and vanilla. She stirred everything together until smooth and thin. The batter poured into the greased dish, spreading easily across the bottom. The pan went into the hot oven set at 350 degrees. She set the timer for 25 minutes. The cake baked until it pulled away from the edges slightly. She made peanut butter frosting while the cake was still in the oven. She heated butter and milk together on the stovetop. She added peanut butter, stirring until it melted and mixed completely. She removed the pan from the heat and added powdered sugar, stirring until smooth and thick. She pulled the cake from the oven when the timer went off. She immediately poured the hot frosting over the hot cake. The frosting spread easily and melted into the surface. She let everything cool completely before cutting. She cut 36 squares when the frosting hardened slightly. The cake was incredibly moist and rich. The peanut butter flavor was strong, but not overwhelming. The frosting added extra peanut butter taste and sweetness. People who loved peanut butter asked for seconds immediately. Children ate this cake faster than any other dessert. Adults said it tasted like peanut butter fudge in cake form. Some people sprinkled chopped peanuts on top for extra crunch. These 30 dump-and-bake desserts fed church congregations through the hardest decades America ever faced. Your grandmother arrived before sunrise with borrowed pans and simple ingredients. She dumped fruit into dishes without measuring precisely. She poured cake mix over everything without stirring carefully. She sliced butter thin and laid pieces across the top. She baked miracles in church basement ovens while families waited upstairs hungry. These desserts proved fancy. Mixing wasn't necessary to feed 48 people. 1 pan, simple ingredients, and your grandmother's determination kept entire congregations fed for pennies. Pick one forgotten dump and bake dessert from this list right now. Buy the ingredients at your grocery store this week. Dump everything into a pan this weekend. Bake it for your family or church potluck. Tell them how grandmothers saved congregations one dump cake at a time. Which dump and bake dessert will you make first today?